The far right making gains across Europe. What's driving that and what are the implications for the European Union? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. The far-right movement enjoyed more political success across Europe in 2023 as it becomes increasingly more mainstream. And 2024 could deliver even greater gains. In November, the longtime far-right politician Geert Wilders sent political shockwaves across Europe when his Party for Freedom swept elections in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, in France, Marine Le Pen and her National Rally Party look poised to make further gains in European elections coming up in 2024. And the Alternative for Germany Party, or AFD, also made gains in 2023. It has an all-time high in the polls. Well, to discuss all of this, joining me now right here in the studio is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, and he's a fellow at the Wilson Center. From New York, we're joined by Dimitrios Soultogiannis. He is a journalist and correspondent for Star Television Greece. Welcome to both of you. Klaus, let's start right here in the studio. Let's start with the success of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. He's an anti-Islam populist and wants to become the prime minister. He still has to put together a coalition. His party did get the biggest number of seats in the last election. He also says if he becomes prime minister, he will hold a referendum to test whether the country wants to leave the European Union. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
But a very pleasant result, of course. By far the largest party in the Dutch political establishment. So I'm very proud. At the same time, it comes with a lot of responsibility. People expect our agenda of hope, tougher asylum and immigration policy.
So if you look at the European media, they say this is sending shockwaves across the continent. How did he manage to gain so much support, and what does it mean for Europe?
Well, it was a shock. You know, no one expected him to win the elections in the Netherlands. He has been trying to get into power for the last 20 years, always with the same slogans, anti-Islamist, very nationalistic, anti-European. And now the Dutch voters actually voted for him to a large extent. And that can be explained largely by one topic, and that is immigration. There's a lot of resentment against foreigners, as they claim, are flooding the small Netherlands. And indeed, there have been many people who are seeking political asylum in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is a small country, both in territorially, but also population-wise. So many countries, many people feel overwhelmed. And I think that really explains his victory. But as you rightly said, he needs a coalition. He cannot govern by himself. So the prospect of he actually becoming prime minister are still kind of remote.
Has this been a very sudden shift in public opinion, or has this been growing for some time?
No, that has been growing for some time. The main mainstream parties may have overlooked that. They may have put their head in the sand, trying to ignore that. But, you know, it has been coming for quite some time. I would say since 2015, 2016, when many Syrian refugees in particular came to Europe, particularly to Germany, but also to other countries like the Netherlands, and a million refugees came during that time, and that shocked the population of Europe.
Nabila, great to see you again. Let's talk about France. The far right is also gaining significant ground in France. Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party now holds about 90 seats in the National Assembly. She says, and she was talking about Wilders' victory in the Netherlands, and she says Wilders' victory is yet another victory for nationalism in Europe. But if we look at France, what's driving the shift to the right there?
Well, I think one important aspect that one needs to bear in mind is that the collapse of the centre-right really is one of the biggest stories in post-war France. And that has effectively allowed the rise of the far-right, because centre-right politicians who are still known as Gaullists, named after General Charles de Gaulle, France's wartime leader, and the architect of the current Fifth Republic. I mean, all right-wing leaders have longed to be called Gaullist because the term encompasses all the values that conservatives believe in, from Christian morality to patriotism. But what has happened in recent years, however, is that the Gaullists have been mired in sleaze scandals, and two recent Gaullist presidents, Nicolas Sarkozy and indeed the late Jacques Chirac, became convicted criminals because of their corruption. And the Gaullists are now called the Republicans, which shows how they try to associate themselves with all that is good with the French Republic, but they are really struggling. And the far right has done extremely well out of this collapse of the center, and French voters increasingly look to extremists for solutions to their problems. So when conservative politicians are in court for corruption, the far right can appear a lot more respectable. And this is especially so when centrist politicians such as Emmanuel Macron start to push their own agenda further and further to the right, especially over issues such as immigration. And the current presidential system of government would allow a far-right president to take advantage of France, to take advantage of the system, to take charge of France, to become head of state, if you like, in France, without a parliamentary majority. And that's pretty frightening for all kinds of reasons.
So, Nabila, would it be fair to say then it's primarily the immigration issue that's driving this shift to the right?
Yes, absolutely. Marine Le Pen, who is the current leader of the far-right National Rally, formerly known as the National Front, has in fact just claimed what she called an ideological victory after forcing, just last night, Macron to accept hard right amendments in his new immigration legislative program. And tough new measures include stricter conditions for residency permits and introduction of immigration quotas. So this is a sure sign that the National Rally is moving away from being a xenophobic protest movement in having an influence over government. And yes, the National Rally only has around 80 MPs or so right now, but the French presidential system, again, allows a determined individual to take charge of the entire system, as Macron himself did. And Le Pen does feel that she can become president at the third attempt in 2027, and Macron won't be able to stand again because French presidents are only allowed 2 terms.
Dimitrios, welcome to the show. The far right's also been doing relatively well in elections in 2023 in Greece. You've got 3 parties, far-right parties, that have now entered parliament. I mean, we did have the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn party. Some of their leaders were jailed in 2020. But how do you explain this continued attraction for the far-right in Greece?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the show. You're absolutely right. Back in June, Greece became the only country in Europe to have 3 far-right parties in the parliament. We're talking about 34 seats in the 300 parliamentary setting. We're talking about 12% of the vote. And we thought we were kind of done with it. You mentioned the Golden Dawn. With after all the trials and with Golden Dawn, most of the members there being already in jail, one would think that Greece is done with this part. The Greeks are coming to an understanding what this means. However, we see 3 parties there, and majorly it's immigration. Greece, as you probably know, is Europe's hub. Most people who want to come into Europe, they have to come across Greece, get into Greece, and then make their way to the rest of Europe. A lot of people, who are voting for far-right parties think that this is a way to say no more. This is a way that they're asking for change. So obviously, we're also seeing a government that right now, the Kyriakos Mitsotakis government is center-leaning to the right, but we're also seeing that disappearing as well. So obviously, economy as well as immigration is, I would say, the 2 most important issues that we're seeing this phenomenon.
Klaus, if we look at the situation in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, whose party has neo-fascist roots, she is, of course, now the Prime Minister, she has since coming to office, she has pushed back on criticism that her party is extreme. Let's listen to what she had to say.
I have been reading that the win of Fratelli d'Italia in the September elections would mean a disaster, leading to an authoritarian turn, Italy's departure from the euro, and other nonsense of this sort. None of this is true.
Question is, how strong is the far right in Italy?
The far right in Italy is quite strong, but what is the phenomenon which we see in Italy and across Europe is that the far right is trying to become established, that they are not espousing totally extreme policies anymore, like Meloni doesn't do that, despite her fascist roots. That is not what she is doing. She has actually become quite respectable, and everyone in Europe, including in the United States as well, is quite relieved that she seems to be a responsible politician on the right of the political spectrum. And you can see that in many other countries, including in Germany, in Europe, where the right is trying not to be too extreme, not to espousing too extreme positions, but become respectable. And that, of course, is one reason why voters are actually flocking to them, because these parties have become almost mainstream.
And what about Germany? I mean, there you have the far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD. They are now Germany's second largest party. What can you tell us about the AfD and their policies?
They are anti-European, they are anti-foreigner, they are criticizing migration and political asylum seekers who come to Germany, but they're also claiming that they are the major opposition party, that they have recipes for the future for how to run the German economy, and they're also trying to put themselves into the mainstream of the political spectrum. However, that is not quite succeeding because they have elements in their party which are really totally unconstitutional, totally extreme. They sympathize with the Nazis of the past, and therefore the domestic German intelligence services has declared some of them as unconstitutional, and there is consideration whether they should actually be banned. But that is of course not reflected in the voting public, because they have achieved quite a few electoral successes recently, including in Western Germany, and their base is really Eastern Germany, but they're now making inroads into Western Germany. So for the mainstream parties, this is very disconcerting. And perhaps one word, it's not just about the success of the far right, it is also about the weakness of the established parties. The Scholz government, the three coalition government, is not doing too well. And I think that is reflected in the success of the far right in Germany.
And this shift to the far right in Germany, Klaus, to what extent did the Russia-Ukraine conflict influence that shift?
It contributed to that quite decisively. The AfD is very pro-Russia, they're very anti-Ukraine. They criticize that over 1 million Ukrainian refugees have found refuge in Germany. They criticize Germany's financial and military aid to Russia. And in some part of the population that is popular. The Germans are not necessarily sympathetic to Russia as such, but they are sympathetic to peace. They don't want to have a war on their doorstep. They want to have basically focus on themselves without being dragged into something militarily, and that is exploited by the AfD. When we compare the AfD with the Nazi party of the past, and of course in Germany's case that is always done, the AfD doesn't want to conquer Eastern Europe. They don't want to have a global Germany which takes over the world. They're actually very nationalistic, very protectionist. They want to shut themselves off rather than getting more involved in military adventures.
Okay, and joining us now is Pieter Cleppe. He joins us from Brussels. He's the editor-in-chief of the Brussels Report. Peter, great to see you. Peter, we're talking about the rise of the far right in Europe. We've been talking about the situation in Germany, in Italy, as well as in the Netherlands. Many of these parties that are gaining ground in these countries are anti-Europe. And I'm wondering to what extent this could impact the future of the European Union.
Well, indeed, I think you see that these parties are typically critical of, the Brussels policy level. They don't want greater transfers of powers to the European Union, and also when it comes to policies like, for example, mandatory relocation of migrants, these parties would indeed be hostile. I mean, the thing is that they are not really in power yet everywhere, and if they are, they have coalition parties. So of course, in practice, often a lot of that is a lot more, let's say, moderate in the end than what some people would expect from the beginning.
Dimitrios, 2024, of course, you'd have a European election that's taking place. It takes place in all the countries across Europe. How well is the right, far right, expected to do, not just in Greece, but across Europe?
I would say it's very unpredictable. I will talk for Greece first. As you know, in the last election, Kyriakos Mitsotakis got 40%, a little more than 40% in the general election. Right now, the problem in Greece is that there's absolutely no opposition. We see the numbers for the leading opposition party, Syriza, declining majorly. PASOK, the third party, is doing a little better in numbers, but in general, there's no opposition. So I would say, as far as Greece is concerned, it's very unpredictable because it will be very tough for Kyriakos Mitsotakis to maintain that high of a percentage that he got in the latest elections. So yes, there is the possibility of seeing some far-right parties doing slightly better in the numbers, and I think that's the case also for many other European countries. In other words, the more the major parties are losing from their percentage, I feel like there's a lot of room, a lot of space for these parties to be gaining success.
Nabila, could Marine Le Pen become the president of France one day? I mean, she has softened her stance on taking France out of the European Union, but should she become president, what would that mean for France and for the EU?
Well, the National Rally was once fiercely anti-EU, but it has toned its rhetoric down because it knows that millions of French people actually support the EU and it wants mainstream votes. And France was, of course, a founding father of the EU project and has generally done very well out of it. And so Le Pen is currently far more interested in radical reform of the EU in France's interest. Le Pen also has a very controversial record as far as her defense rhetoric is concerned. She has been a very big backer of Putin in Russia, for example, and has accepted Russian loans for her campaigns. She used to go and visit Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin. And Marine Le Pen says that she wants to pull out of NATO's integrated command system, which is equally controversial because that would be highly regressive and cause a lot of friction with countries such as Britain and indeed America.
Plus, those issues that Nabila talks about there, the far right's hopes that they would gain power and then reduce their dependence on the United States, for instance, for security, also reform of the EU. Should the far right do well in the European elections next year, what does that mean?
We don't know for sure, and it depends how extreme they really will be and what they can implement. But as far, for example, as Germany is concerned, the German AfD is very far from power. They've built a firewall around that party, so no other party wants to enter into a coalition with that party. And we also have to be fair to Europe. Not everything is going into the direction of the right. When you look at Poland, a liberal politician, the former European politician Tusk, is now Polish Prime Minister. So I think there is still some reason for hope that not everything is going the way of the right-wing parties. It really depends on the development of the situation and what the existing liberal governments do to tackle the problems they are faced with, both economic problems, migration problems, and energy and living cost problems. All that, I think, plays an enormous role. We also should remember many people vote for the right-wing parties out of protest. It is a protest vote still. Once it comes to the actual election and they have to make their little cross in the election box, will they still go for the right? And I think some will, of course, but some others will have second thoughts. And I think that is the hope in Germany, and that is also the hope in many other European countries. Whether that hope is justified, well, we will find out.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the point that Nabila raised a moment ago on perhaps how this could impact NATO?
In the end, I don't think so. I think it is a big step for any country being led by a right-wing government or a liberal government to leave NATO, to leave the European Union. We have the example of the UK, which did leave the European Union. What a disaster that was. And all the other countries, for example, take Hungary, they are dependent on money from the European Union. They're also dependent on security from NATO. Are they going to take that step and really leave these organizations which have been proven to be very beneficial to their countries? That is rhetoric. They will shout their propaganda slogans out against Europe, against NATO, but in the end, I don't think they will actually vote to leave these two organizations.
Pieter Cleppe, if the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues for the next few months, what impact will that have on domestic politics in the European Union?
Well, you could already see that Ukraine was becoming more and more of a factor splitting, European governments. At the last EU summit, it was not just the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, but also the new leader of Slovakia that was taking, you could say, some kind of a pro-Russian position, or at least obstructive to the Western plan to try to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. So I think also if you look at national debates in France, in the Netherlands, you see that the right is also more wary of, I mean, they're not necessarily pro-Putin, but they're more wary of sort of intervening in that conflict. They don't believe it's the right path to take. So yeah, the conflict is playing a big role, and it's sort of being a roller coaster. Ukraine was doing well, and then Putin was on the defensive with Wagner marching to Moscow until now. In fall, the Ukrainian offensive seems to have failed, and Russia is doing rather well according to most analysts. And then, of course, the situation in the United States will also have an effect on all of that. So indeed, I think the war, we should not underestimate the importance of that for the debate at the European level and at the national level.
Dimitrios, of course, there is another big conflict taking place right now. It's Israel's assault on Gaza. That is having an impact in Europe as well as other parts of the world as well. But there is rising anti-Semitism in Europe as well. I mean, we should note that Israel considers any criticism of the country and its policies to be anti-Semitic. Europe has been a strong supporter of Israel, but how could it impact, say, a country like Greece?
So the Greek people obviously, were divided in these past couple of months. They started being very pro-Israel, and then now you have skeptics, just like in the United States. So people started, supporting Israel 100%. And as the war is unfolding, obviously a lot of people in Greece are asking for ceasefire. And let's not forget that, also a great ally of the United States, like Greece, is also following the American lead. So also, a lot of politicians in Greece and obviously the general public are also waiting to see how Joe Biden is gonna, what he's going to say in the days and months moving forward with this conflict. So I really do believe that it's starting to change. So the general opinion is not what it was when the war first started, but everybody's still very worried, and especially for Greece, this is something you're seeing in your pocket, in the economy, in the day-to-day life. The war obviously is affecting the everyday life. So obviously the Greek people, like a lot of European countries, want to see a ceasefire sooner rather than later.
Nabila, in France, is there any kind of connection between the rise of the right and what is considered the mainstream policies of the country in terms of the Middle East, especially the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Well, France is home to the largest Muslim community in Western Europe. It's also the home of the largest Jewish community. So there is always a lot of friction when there are contentious issues in the Middle East, not least of all a devastating conflict as we currently seeing unfolding. What doesn't help, however, is when the French government sets about to ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and it has done over the years, not least of all during François Hollande's presidency, the former socialist president. And so France's foreign policy seems to have shifted from a traditionally pro-Arab position to a more pro-Israel position, unconditionally supporting Israel in this conflict. We've heard, however, the qualified word from Macron calling, for Israel to stop basically killing civilians, including children, the elderly, and indeed women. He stopped short of calling it a genocide, but his words were quite strong before he actually took them back, surprisingly enough. But I think that the argument that the government has been putting forward to ban those pro-Palestinian demonstrations was quite absurd. It effectively argued that the pro-Palestinian marchers were too disorderly and were a threat to public order. Now, this is quite absurd when you consider that the national pastime in France is literally violent rioting, whether it's to do with pension reforms or indeed, the retirement age. And we all have in mind the legacy of leaders such as former presidents such as Jacques Chirac, who firstly opposed the war in Iraq, or indeed his prime minister Dominique de Villepin, and Macron is firmly, stands in sharp contrast to that position.
Klaus, I've just got a minute left. There's been quite a debate that's been going on in Europe as well as here in the United States on the quality of leadership in Europe. People talk about Emmanuel Macron, people talk about Olaf Scholz and say that there's been a failure of leadership in Europe. Is that justified?
I think it is, to some extent at least. Macron is not doing a bad job as a European politician. He's much less popular domestically. There have been lots of uprisings, demonstrations against social and economic policies. Olaf Scholz, I think, is doing a reasonable job under difficult circumstances, but he's not a communicator. He can't bring across what he's actually doing, and he creates, in the countries, there's a feeling of instability. And the wars we just talked about, that of course adds to that. Rising living costs, migration, economic problems, budget crisis, you just name it, and Olaf Scholz is not seen as having an awful lot of charisma to deal with that.
Yeah, host of issues there.
Indeed.
Okay, that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. I'm Arnold Naidu. That's the latest edition of The Heat.